And we are back. Yes, just before the break, Paula Bean mentioned the choice between JSON and XML. And I agree with you. I would probably pick JSON myself in such a case, simply because it is easier to read as a human being. Um, Having said that, Microsoft has actually implemented a fairly efficient XML library that comes stock with the .NET framework. Over the years, they have really put a lot of time and effort into speed optimizing the XML parsers. So it has become a lot faster, a lot more efficient, and a lot better at handling broken XML as well. Now, in terms of APIs, as long as we are talking web APIs, the choice is there between JSON and XML for the most part for most APIs. In terms of actual data being transferred, we'll take a quick look at what it actually means. Today, we honestly do not know what the buffer size is for any given browser in terms of doing the TCP/IP packet transfers from server to client and the other way around. But let's, for the sake of argument, say that the buffer size is set to 10 kilobytes. Now, if you are downloading a 15 kilobyte JSON file with some kind of setting structure in it, that particular file will effectively be broken into two packets to transfer the entire contents of it, because you have some amount of overhead in terms of the HTTP protocol. Now, if we are talking about non-web-based APIs, and there are a lot of those as well, they are by definition, for the most part, always a lot more efficient in terms of data transfer because they rely on binary transfers. Now, if you have, say, 50 or 100 settings that this particular API call exposes, and you pack those into binary data, then you can easily get below the 10 kilobyte buffer size in transferring these settings from one computer to another. Whereas if you have to do them in text that humans can read, then you end up having multiple packets being transferred between the two computers. When it comes to costs of transferring that data, it should be pretty obvious which of the two methods is the most cost effective. That would always be the binary transfer, simply because you are capable of packing so much more information into a binary stream than you can into a text-based stream. Having said that, if I have the option to choose how to transmit data, I would by definition always choose the binary transfer, simply because I can reduce the amount of data being transferred back and forth. In terms of wireless networking, we also have a high limitation on the amount of bandwidth that we can spend when transferring data wirelessly. And again, the binary way of doing things means smaller data packets, which means there's a smaller risk of having to retransmit the data package because it got lost somewhere in the wireless link. Um, True. It is absolutely true that machine time is cheaper than programmer time. But at the end of the day, we also need to look at the cost of implementing um, greater amounts of hardware being capable of handling greater amounts of data being transferred back and forth. One of the major reasons that web pages today are loading so slowly is because of lack of the use of zlib compression in the HTTP protocol, um, and the total and utter disregard for um, data spendage reduction by modern developers. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, and I know there are lots of people that disagree with me, in my opinion, we as developers have a responsibility of trying our best to reduce the amount of data that our product has to transmit. If there is a way for us to reduce the amount of data, we should. It is a moral question, I know, and it is something that is highly debatable. This is just my opinion. Um, but in any case, the evidence is out there. And you see it pretty much every single day. You see servers that take a long time to respond when you want to access a page on a web server somewhere. You see a page partially loading and then waiting for um, some jQuery script, which is JavaScript, that post loads a lot of stuff on the page afterwards, and the result is that you're effectively sitting there waiting maybe 20 or 30 seconds for this particular web page to finish its loading process. Why? Because it's based on slow executing code. It's based on bulky and bloaty content setups, and it is based on a text-based technology that requires a lot of bandwidth for transfer. And the more strain we put on the infrastructure to transfer larger and larger amounts of data just to convey, say, the front page of Facebook, for example, the larger these data blobs become, the slower it will be, because you can only put so much data through each individual pipeline. Granted, pipelines are getting expanded and upgraded all the time, but that's strictly to keep up with the, in my opinion, lazy attitude. It doesn't matter how much data we spend, because technology is just getting better every day. While that holds true, um, in my opinion, it's not really a valid point of view going into it with the I don't really care how much data I'm spending. It's not just images on web pages. If you take a look at the actual size of and sheer amount of CSS files, JavaScript files, and the HTML itself that makes up the page without all the media stuff loaded, you will be quite surprised how big they are. Um, yes, and that is again something that proves my point. I don't care how big it is. And for the most part, it is not binary uncompressed data. Most images being transferred today are either JPEG compressed or PNG compressed. The only instance where the image might end up as binary uncompressed data is if it's loaded up as, say, a bitmap in memory. But during the actual network transfer, it is for the most part always compressed. Um, just imagine how much smoother and how much faster the entire net would run if we at some point converted all of the heavily aging HTML and CSS setups into, how should I put this, raw binary instructions instead. And even then you could still apply some measure of compression algorithms to that binary data being transferred. But yeah, um, that's just one way of kind of proving the point of there are far more efficient ways of doing actual data transfer than we're doing today. Well, um, the majority of internet traffic, yes, we're slowly moving towards um, actual, how should I put this, movie media taking up more and more bandwidth. No doubt about that. That is primarily because of how people have adopted the ability to stream moving pictures over the net. But having said that, if you look at the sheer amount of data that's being transferred as part of, say, a movie stream or in my case, I'm streaming my desktop, um, the compression algorithms for packing up the data that makes up the images. Yeah, kill all streams. Those compression algorithms are only getting better for every year that passes. But when you look at how people choose to, say, build web accessible or internet accessible APIs and how to communicate with them, people are more and more moving towards using either JSON or XML to throw some kind of data across the internet. And that tendency, in my opinion, is the wrong direction to go in, because that basically just leads us to how should I put this, support even greater spendage of bandwidth that we can, we as developers have the power to help reduce instead. In my honest opinion, I would much rather spend my bandwidth being able to view say the latest episode of The Expanse in 1080p than being forced to reduce it to 720p because of lack of bandwidth between myself and the server that hosts it. Because whatever pipeline I'm sitting on needs to spend, say, 50% of its total capacity delivering JSON API responses. Um, where we could reduce that bandwidth spendage by converting over to using binary formats instead. And that then again comes to um, the kind of lagginess and resource spendage that we see on modern operating systems. Take, for example, the latest version of Windows, Windows 10, Microsoft has gone through and done a lot of resource spendage reduction in Windows 10 compared to Windows 7. I'm on Windows 7, and my Windows 7 will simply not run without spending at least about 2 gigabytes of memory. Now, if you look at the memory footprint of operating systems versus the footprint of all the applications that you're running, you are in effect using a lot of resources just running your computer and your operating system that potentially could be reduced if a little more thought went into the design of the code. And this is where I'm kind of trying to make the point that if you're the kind of developer that doesn't really care whether you have 250 objects to solve this particular task, or you can reduce that to, say, 10 objects and maybe 15 structures instead to do the same task, then you kind of need to look at how much, how many resources you're actually spending completing that particular task. If you, as part of your code design, keep in mind at all times to do what you can to reduce the amount of resources spent doing this particular task, then that also leads to your ability to shoehorn way more features into that application if you already did a lot of resource spendage reduction. Um, Of course, there is a time constraint for the most part in terms of development projects. Definitely. If you are a one-man team developing something, then I guess it comes down to what the actual cost is for developing a specific project for a specific customer. Of course, that has something to do, but a change in your choice and behavior um, in terms of how you choose to implement your code. Um, that is something that is a little easier to do than to grab the project and extend it by, say, 2 more weeks of development. I'm not saying that you should completely cut your way of doing things and do it a different way, but um, do a little more thinking about how you choose to design your code and try to steer away from the I don't care how much or how many resources this particular project ends up spending. Um, at the end of the day, the more resources you spend, both in terms of CPU, memory, how much you have to rely on, say, other kind of hardware enabled um, performance assistance, say, for example, using the graphics card to render parts of your UI, whatever, um, the more you have to rely on other resources to grant better performance, the more you rely on other people's code to achieve the goal. Um, Whereas if you change your code design behavior a little bit to think about the resource footprint that your product ends up spending. You can reduce the amount of bugs you run into. You can reduce performance problems. You can reduce overall memory bloating for your product. And at the end of the day, those are things that you would at some point have to look into during a project anyways. So if you can manage to change your initial implementation behavior to accommodate a little more optimization at the beginning of the project instead of having to force yourself into an optimization process itself, then you could eliminate that entire process entirely because of a behavior change. So, I mean, of course, it's still up to the individual developer, but that's the way I see things. And you're completely free to completely disagree with me if you want to, of course. I won't hold it against you. But, I mean, you could also say that unoptimized code is a lot more lazy. Um, Premature optimization in when when you look at actual code design, um, in terms of whether things are um, the size of your source code doesn't really matter all that much. The main point of it is what is the actual footprint of the application that you're building while it's running. How much does it spend? Yes, that part is definitely true. But When talking about optimization, whether it's premature or optimized versus non-optimized, it's not a matter of pushing the agenda that premature optimized code has a greater chance of bugs. I'm sorry, but I have to disagree with you on that one. Um, you might accuse the code that I've been writing here of premature optimization, but overall, through this entire project, there has only been one bug as such that crept in, and that particular bug was not the result of premature optimization. That was a design oversight on my part. Um, Other than that, as long as you try to keep things minimalistic when designing your code, you're on the right path, in my opinion, because that is the most important thing in terms of designing your code, because keeping minimalistic code reduces the chance of bugs, but it also reduces overall reduces the chance of memory bloating, and thereby also reduces the required amount of resources to run this particular project or this particular application. Um, One point where you could do a minor behavior change is the point of analyzing your class definitions versus whether you could use a structure for it. For the most part, I advise people to um, stop for a minute and think about the code that they are about to start implementing. If this particular code is a setup where you have, say, two or three different choices of how you can implement this particular thing, and one or two of these choices follow the KISS principle, keep it stupid simple, which clashes well with minimalistic design, then you should choose those over the other one any day. Major reason is simpler implemented code is easier to um, debug. It's easier to work out exactly what it does, and it has a smaller overall resource footprint. So that should be your choice every time. Um, um, no, and I would definitely have to agree with you on that one, Joban. Um, um, Source code needs to be written in a way where the code accomplishes the task at hand, and in my opinion, at the minimal cost of resources possible. Um, the primary way of accomplishing that is by keeping your code minimalistic and by avoiding creating things like a lot of object inheritance, and a lot of interface definitions unless you absolutely need them. Those are just effectively icing on the cake that ends up constructing things that leads to a bigger resource footprint. The more stuff you have to load, the longer it takes, and the more memory you end up spending. Well, it's not a matter of not doing smart things, but a matter of um, doing things the smart way. If you get into the habit of documenting your code and saving code snippets of something that you created that does a specific task, and then re-implement that code when you need it for something different, then you're going through smart design of your code. Definitely get into the habit of documenting everything that you do. I know it takes a little bit longer to do things when you do that, but at the end of the day, When you come back to your code 6 months later, then you can simply just read the documentation for it and get into working with this particular piece of code again fairly quickly. Whereas if you don't document things, you will have to sit down and read through the code to figure out exactly what it does. Um, One of the major things that I hated back in the day was and this was when I was in my teens, still learning how to actually build applications. But I absolutely hated whenever my dad came up to me and said, "Did you remember to document?" Oh, leave me be. I don't want to do that. It's boring. It doesn't make any sense. Why do I have to? But I adopted the habit of documenting things and down the line learned why he was so adamant about the documentation. You don't have to spend an entire day rereading your code if you do some documentation. Um, yes, and that would be the main reason why you should document. Um, it definitely helps out in the long run. With that, I'll see if I can get back to, yeah, pretty much. Let's see if we can get some stuff done here. All right, we were about to implement listing these schedules. So, all right, we know that we have a backup schedule and a restart schedule. So we definitely um, let's see, edit schedule. That one sets up for, let me get rid of some of this so I can get back on track. Oh, right, the checkbox, the text box, and the browse button. Those were the ones we needed to manipulate here. Um, okay, so um, if it is a backup, actually we could probably, yeah, let's set those. So if the backup flag is set, then the checkbox needs to be checked. The text box, whether we need to enable it or not doesn't really matter because we set it to read only. But we definitely need to enable or disable the browse button according to what the checkbox says. So let's start by setting the checked property of the checkbox according to what the temp scheduled backup has. We also need to enable and disable the browse button according to whether it's a backup profile or not. So we'll do that here. Set the checkbox and the browse button enabled, disabled according to profile. There we go. If it is a backup thing, then we should set whatever path might be stored. So we'll get the backup path right there. And if it's not set, then we'll simply clear the text box, like so. There we go. And when we're done doing this, we then need to show the group. So let's get that in there. Set this visible. There we go. And what else do we need? Right now it would be interesting to see if we can actually whether this is a new profile or an existing one. The way we can accomplish that is by say manipulating the where is it schedule profile manipulating the server host ID. We know from the main setup that if the server host ID is positive, then it is an assigned ID that is currently linked to a host instance. Um, um, so if we're creating a new schedule, we could easily set the server host ID to, say, for example, -2, indicating to us on the UI here that it is a new profile. And in doing so, we can then disable the remove button because it doesn't make any sense that we can remove a profile that we are about to create. So let's go up and do that. So if we grab the remove buttons enabled property and set that according to whether the temp schedules server host ID is -2. If it is, and yes, I know that this can be written much simpler, that one, and otherwise it would be true, because it could be -1, meaning that it hasn't been linked yet, but the profile exists, or it could be a positive value because it links to one of the active profiles that are currently running. Now, this particular setup can also be written like this. Remove enabled equals temp schedule server host ID -2. That kind of depends on what it is I'm building. If it's something where that particular setup is exposed out of the application, then yes, I do make use of magic identifiers. If it's something internal like this, I rarely ever do it because for the most part it just means a bunch of extra variables declared or constants which take up on the data segment in a setup where it's for the most part not really needed. The -2 setting is specific to this window only, and it will only occur when we're creating a new profile. So to me it makes little sense creating, say, a constant that meaningfully identifies what -2 means. In the previous designs and setups of these particular host ID numbers, they all start at -1 because -1 indicates out of bounds for any kind of array listing. That's the generally accepted setting for it. The selected index for a drop-down, combo box and a list box will always return -1 if no entry is selected. So that's where the -1 comes from. For this case, I need an extra setting just to control this one button, and that's it. So the only instance where I need this is for this particular dialog. But yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. It might make more sense if this particular code was a team collaboration. since I'm streaming this and I'm grabbing all of the individual segments of the stream, recording them to disk and uploading them to YouTube, um, there is definitely the initial design source and explanation available as part of these video segments. So anyone that wants to dig into this project and fully grasp what's part of it is free to go through the videos and pick up all the different things that have been discussed instead of just looking at the code and going, hey, that means this. Yes, I should probably go up and declare meaningful identifiers for these things and put them in there um, for the sake of people being able to read this a lot easier. Um, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I should do that. For the moment, I honestly haven't given that part much thought since I've been kind of explaining things as I move along. Um, but yeah, we should probably do that. That's one of the things, I guess, where I'm a little lazy. um, I can't remember how well I went about explaining the -1 setup for uh, the initial host ID setup. That was a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I probably should do that in terms of making it more readable for someone digging into the project. Not gonna bother this time around, sorry. Okay, so, but we can do this instead. For handling the creation of new profiles, new schedule profiles, there will be a single instance of that server host ID containing the value -2. These instances are only occurring within this single window for the sole purpose of being able to detect new schedule profiles being created. There we go. All right. Yeah, I should probably in the following. Indicates a new profile which allows us to disable the remove button. There we go. Now it's put in comments, which means it doesn't take up extra memory declaring a variable for it. There we go. All right. Sometimes it might be beneficial doing this, especially if you're doing data structures that are exposed out of the application, as in, for example, say over a network protocol. It is highly beneficial using tokens to indicate a specific value, and I do that all the time. Because that typically leads to a lot of these different tokens being declared as part of the data structure itself, and it can be pretty tricky keeping all of those in your mind whenever you're working with it. So yes, I do employ tokens to replace an actual numeric value for something. Sometimes I even make use of enums to take care of that, depending on what kind of data structure I use. Um, yes, it's definitely 1995. um, But yes, I do make use of, and they are called tokens. Yes, I know that the modern way of declaring them is some kind of meaningful identifier, and there are tons of different ways to define these. I stick with the old school setup, which is token. Um, and that is something that you will see mentioned as part of commenting in most C and C++ source codes. They refer to them as tokens. So I would advise adopting that particular expression for doing these particular constants or variables, however you choose to set them up. Um, in any case, when creating a new profile, we need to talk to the new button. Um, so I think it would be kind of nice if, when creating a new um, welcome to the stream, AKR commando. No, not anymore. I stopped doing Minecraft plugins and such 2, 3 years ago. It was too much work, and there were too many dissatisfied people complaining about anything and everything they could complain about, and I felt it just wasn't worth the effort anymore. Um, so no, I don't do that anymore. Too much Java, the wrong kind of Java. I prefer the liquid kind that sits in my cup. Okay, so we built the editor here fairly quickly. Um, we set up the browse button, we set up the remove button, those are fine. So let's add in another method to create a brand new profile for us. We might as well do that and have it adopt basically the current time of day. So let's add in another one, create new schedule, like so. And the only thing that this will do is preset the temp schedule with some meaningful data. So let's dig into that. Um, we definitely want to put in, say, a regular restart schedule, since creating a backup schedule requires that we also specify where the backups should go. So we'll just do a simple restart profile, and since we need to inform the rest of this dialog that this is a new profile, we also need to make sure that we set the server host ID to -2, as mentioned in the comments. On top of that, we also need to work out if the current minute count fits within our setup. So to do that, we will simply grab something similar to the other one. And just for the sake of keeping things fairly straightforward, we'll grab the date, time, now, minute, divide that by 15, and we should get something that fits. And then we can set the temp schedule equals new schedule profile. We have to set the server host ID to -2. Um, There we go. Server host ID followed by hour followed by minute. The reason we need to set it to -2 is to indicate to the schedule editor that this is a new profile, so it can disable the remove button. And here we'll just grab the hour, and then we'll put in the interval here, and that's it. Indicates that this is a new schedule profile. There we go. And as you can see in this setup of comments, we're describing what the -2 means without having to declare another memory spending constant to act as a token for this particular value. Overall, if you can avoid creating a variable, avoid it. For the sake of building this particular code, there are instances where I do create variables where they could be avoided, but I keep these in just to give at least some measure of understanding of what's going on. As I've put as the, how should I put it, disclaimer on my videos on YouTube, the code written here might not always be the most efficient way of accomplishing any specific task. Some of them are set up this way for the sole purpose of allowing at least some measure of readability. Okay. That aside, this should now take care of creating a new profile for us. So we'll grab this, go down to the new button, have it force the creation of a new schedule, and then we will edit it. There we go. That takes care of that. Next up, we kind of need to implement some kind of logic for the checkbox, because the checkbox needs to control the browse button being enabled or disabled. We also need to put some logic into the save, remove, and cancel buttons. So let's grab the events for these quick, like so, and there. All right, so now we've got these, and we'll move these up to the control events. Right about here. There we go. All right, so if the checkbox is checked or unchecked, we kind of need to update the browse button. So since we now have a measure of detection, we will simply just go ahead and do a quick check on the no, actually we don't need to do that. We will simply just set the browse buttons enabled property according to what the checked state of the checkbox is. Enable, disable the browse button according to the checkbox. There we go. Fairly simple. Next up, the browse button itself. We might as well just do a folder browse dialog for that, and then make sure that we enable the ability to create a new folder. So let's grab a folder browser dialog, create that, and set some properties for it. Now for this one, select the path to where you would like to store backups. There we go. We also have the option to show new folder button. We'll enable this, allow the user to create new folders. And what else do we want to set? We may want to set the selected path. And why would we want to do that? Well, um, if we pass the folder of this particular or the path of this particular server instance to this dialog when we show it, then we can pre-configure this folder browser dialog to point to the root of where the server instance is in case the user wants to, say, create a subfolder there called backups and then have it dump the backups in there. That could be useful if, for example, you set up an FTP server that points into the server folder itself so that whoever has FTP access can get at the backups there, and you don't have to configure virtual folders for the FTP service. Just a design thought. And for now, we'll just do this empty since we don't have any means of referencing the server instance folder yet. Change to point to the server instance folder instead. There we go. All right. So next up, we'll show the dialog, make it modal, and wait for an OK response. If this is set OK, then we can store that path in the text box. We don't want to put it into the temp profile just yet because we only want to update the actual scheduled changes whenever the save button is hit. So for now, we will simply just put it in here. But before we do that, actually, we kind of might want to dialog that selected path. We might want to grab this. As I've done pretty much everywhere else in this project, I would like to ensure that we have a trailing backslash on the path that we are getting here. So for that purpose, we want to check if the last character of the path string is not a backslash, then we will add it to it. There we go. And then we will put it into the text box. There we go. This now ensures that we always have a trailing backslash on whatever path might be chosen. And finally, we of course need to dispose of the dialog since we don't need it anymore. And that should take care of the browse button, which is this one. We still have the save, remove, cancel buttons to set up. And we should probably also see about figuring out how we will handle editing a specific not if the dialog response is OK. This particular check checks to see whether this particular dialog returns with an OK response. That can only happen if the user has selected a valid path and clicked the actual OK button. If an invalid or empty path is selected, the dialog always returns cancel. So no, there is no situation where it can return an empty string. Not when the result is the OK result. All of the file open dialog, the open file dialog, and the save file dialog, and the folder browse dialog are all basically built according to the same principle. And that principle is that it will only return a dialog result of OK when a valid path and or file has been selected. Yes. In terms of the folder browse dialog, it can only return an actual valid path or drive reference on the current computer if the OK button is selected and that path actually does exist. In all other cases, you will get a dialog result of cancel. And in that case, selected path will, for the most part contain whatever path you might have put into the property before you showed the dialog itself. Sometimes it might be empty, sometimes it might contain whatever path you put in there before showing it. That kind of depends on which version of Windows it's executing on. There are subtle changes between the different Windows versions in terms of what kind of junk data is returned whenever you cancel something, which is kind of why you need to examine and use the actual responses from the dialogues instead. A positive from a dialog will only occur if whatever was selected in that dialog is actually valid and usable. All right. So at the moment we have a slight problem with this one. For the time being, we don't have a method of grabbing the server instance path and stuffing it into this dialog. So we should probably look into doing something about that. Now up here we had some properties, but I think we should probably have a look at this one, because in here we actually added a method for passing that particular path, if I remember right. Didn't we? No, we didn't. Not this one. Then we did it in this one. I think we did it in this one, yes. Okay, let's see. Server config dialog load, blah, 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 blah. Public methods. See, here we put set Minecraft server path as a method. And just for the sake of using the same naming convention and the same way of accessing stuff and doing stuff, I think we'll just make use of what we did here already. So we'll grab this and then close these because we don't need them, but we do need it here. So let's do some public methods and stuff it in here. And that's what we need. So we'll grab that, put it in here. There we go. And then here we will set a path variable so we can stuff it in the browse dialog when we need to show it. Alternatively, we can, whenever the OK button of the folder browse dialog is clicked, we can also update that path to reflect the last selection whenever it's popped again. So here we'll do a, no, actually we should probably do that. Yeah, we'll go up here and do a helper method for that. Like so. No, not this one. Here we go. Okay, so private string last open path. We'll use that. And then we'll do a method here that we'll call update last open path. And this will take care of accepting a path here, and then update the last open path variable with whatever new path was selected. So um, here we'll make sure that this path actually has a length to avoid any kind of index out of bounds exceptions. Here we'll return whatever was put in there, and then do the trailing backslash check here, and then we'll modify some of the other stuff a little bit because we can then make use of this. Oops, like so. Then return path plus a backslash. Otherwise, return. Oh, sorry, we are not returning stuff here. We are updating this one. Equals this. And else we'll just set this equal to path, and then that one. That should take care of it for us. Okay, so what this one does is it just updates the locally stored last open path, and that lets us go down here and simply update that. Update last open path with whatever path was passed from whatever form or object created this particular dialog. And then we will go find the browse button, which is right here, and that will then let us use the update last open path with whatever was selected in the dialog. That then takes care of this for us. So we can remove that, and then we'll just use last open path instead, because the update method handles the trailing backslash for it. This then also allows us to pre-specify the last open path like this, which will then force the folder browse dialog to initially point to the folder where the server instance resides, and then remember whatever path was selected the last time this particular dialog was opened. It's just a little bit of convenience stuff. Okay, so we also need to work on the save button and the remove button and the cancel button. Well, that is a very good question. And that is actually a question you should be capable of answering yourself, given what's written here. I see a lot of developers declare their variables like this instead. Last open path 2. Now, what is the major difference between this declaration and this declaration? And as an addition to it, yes. When you specify string.empty as an initialization value or a clear value, then you are actually specifying null. You're not specifying an actual empty string. So string.empty equals null. Yes. But the main reason that C will throw stack garbage in there is because C allows you to directly access memory, which C# does not. In C and C++, you can address memory that your application doesn't own. That is something that is not possible to do in C# at all. Simply because the .NET framework does all of the memory management for you. It also means that in C and C++, you manually have to do a lot more in terms of memory management when declaring variables. Something like resizing the length of an array in C and C++ is a hell of a lot more complicated than it is in a nice and managed language like C# is. Here you basically never have to worry about um, any kind of memory referencing or memory handling yourself. The common language runtime handles all that for you. All right, so if the schedule dialog for some reason is past a empty path, the last open path will basically be empty when the folder browse dialog is popped with selected path being empty. It will pop the dialog showing the topmost object in a default folder browse setup, which typically means this computer. Underneath that, it will list all of your typical profile stuff like your downloads, your desktop, your documents, your images, videos, music, all that stuff, and then computer and the drives underneath that one. That's typically what happens if selected path is empty. So by pre-initializing our last open path with an empty string, not null, we don't run into any kind of null exceptions. We don't run into any kind of trouble with the update last open path, because if an empty string is passed, it simply won't update it, and that effectively leads it to its pre-initialized state, which is an empty string. Pretty straightforward. For the most part, when developers just declare a variable in a language that supports pre-initialization, you will for the most part, always end up having a variable that is declared as yes, absolutely. Like I did before on this one, last open path 2. This is now just declared, but it contains a value of null. Which means if we try to pass null to something that expects an actual string, we'll get a null exception. Whenever you have a language that does support pre-initialization of your variables, I highly recommend always making sure that you pre-initialize some kind of standard value or default value for whatever that variable is for. That way you don't have to put in extra code to ensure that your variable has been properly initialized, and you can expect that it is at least initialized with your chosen default value. That just removes so many possible bugs from your entire project if you get into the habit of always ensuring that you have them pre-initialized with something. And if you can't pre-initialize that particular variable because you have to, say, instantiate this with a specific parameter when you're creating an object, then pre-initialize it to null so you know exactly what it is, and then do a check to see if it's null, and then initialize it. Or if you need to reinitialize that variable with a new setup, like for example the server host object we've got here, it expects you to specify a host ID when you instantiate the object. So if you need to reinstantiate it, make sure that you have terminated it and destroyed it, and then effectively trashed it by setting it to null, and then do the new initialization afterwards. That way you are in the most effective terms you possibly can, you are telling the garbage collector whatever data was in here needs to be destroyed. The garbage collector is a pretty brilliant guy. When he stops by and checks to see if he needs to destroy data, he actually verifies that this particular data has been released and can be removed. But by disposing of an object and setting it to null whenever you can, you are instructing the garbage collector this data must be destroyed as soon as possible. So you're getting rid of whatever might be on the stack or in memory a lot faster by keeping very clear um, definitions of what can be gotten rid of and what might not be safe to remove just yet. Sometimes the garbage collector does get it wrong and you get some really weird things happening. But if you always make sure that you pre-initialize and you clean up after yourself, there is no place where it can go wrong with your instructions in terms of releasing memory that you have previously occupied for something. Um, it's just like mom told us when we were young, clean up your room. In terms of coding, um, I know that modern languages don't put that requirement on us, but it's still something that I preach. Be a respectful programmer and tell your compiler, I am now done using this. Please destroy this data. I don't need it anymore. Um, that also ensures that you know exactly what you're doing with the data. And in your code, it reflects to yourself, well, I have done this the right way, so the bug is most likely not here if you're searching for some weird behavior. Um, Clean up after yourself, pre-initialize. That's the way to um, achieve better safety in terms of your code executing because you know all of the states of your variables during the variable's entire lifetime. If you rely on a compiler somewhere to take care of a lot of these things for you, then it may be more difficult to determine exactly where something goes wrong. Yes. All right. Moving on. Let's see if we can get some more stuff done here. All right. So we kind of still need to hook into the list box, which we've indicated right here. We also need to check the save stuff, the remove, the cancel. Cancel should be fairly easy since we don't really need to do much there except basically just hide the what's it called? The group. The save thing should also be fairly straightforward. Since it basically just needs to look at the different controls and stuff them into the temp schedule that we've created. And then from there, update the schedule list if needed. But we may at some point want to build in another helper method to rearrange all of the schedules in the list according to what time of day they are supposed to trigger. If we do that within the dialog here, then this particular helper method would take care of that particular rearrangement for us, and it will then also reflect on the UI. Okay, we don't need to keep that anymore, so we'll get rid of that. Definitely don't forget the coffee. Sky, you drank it all again. Is that why you reminded me of the coffee? All right, let's get a fresh cup of coffee here, and then we'll see about putting in some save stuff. Okay, so There's actually one more thing that we should probably handle at some point, and that would be updating the server host ID within each schedule. At the moment, it doesn't really matter whether we update that particular piece of information within the schedule editor or in the main form, as long as we remember to um, um, update the schedules with the profile ID that this schedule belongs to. We just need to remember to do that. Okay, so for now, we need to examine what choices were made on the schedule editor. Um, um, decaffeinated coffee. Not quite sure I want to. I prefer being twitchy. Okay, never mind. We definitely need to store the event hour, so we'll grab that directly from the hour drop-down box. Um, would help if I hit the right key. Grab that there. Will be a little bit different with the minute selection, but shouldn't be all that big of an issue because we can do the minute selected index times 15. If first index is selected, then 1 times 15 equals 15. If the second is selected, then 2 times 15 equals 30, and so on. Next up, store the backup setting, which would be from the backup checkbox. And from here, we actually need to figure out whether the backup checkbox was selected or not. Because if it is unchecked, then we want to force the backup path to be empty. Whereas if it is checked, then we need to grab the path that's stored in the text box. So let's grab a quick check. If this is true, then we need the backup path to grab what's in the text box. There we go. And since we are now saving, we kind of need to figure out whether this might have an indication of -2 in the server host ID. If it does, then we at least need to change it to -1. So we'll do that quick. If the server host ID is -2, then switch it to -1. There we go. If this is a new schedule profile, set it to unassigned for now. There we go. All right. The final thing that we need to do is basically add it to the current schedule list. It's only, well, at the moment, the text box is not really handled in any way, shape, or form, except that it will contain an empty string whenever the dialog is instantiated and shown. However, if we decide to set the check mark in the checkbox and specify a path, and we then realize, oh, this should actually be a restart event instead, and remove the check mark, then the path would still be in the text box. Um, Hence why I'm doing the check here to ensure that it only grabs the path in the case where the backup checkbox has been set. Um, since we are using a, let's see if we can find it quick, schedule profile editing, we are always instantiating it here as a restart event, and in the profile it forces the backup path to be empty. Um, in create new schedule, we are utilizing the exact same nope. The only thing that we do is change the enabled state of the browse button. That's it. We might actually have done it as part of the editor. Let's see. Yeah, that's part of showing the profile, the schedule profile, whenever the editor is enabled. So if we create a new profile or we click an existing profile in the list box, then that triggers the display of the schedule editor group, and it will then preset the backup path text box to empty if whatever schedule is selected has a backup profile or doesn't have one. The If the folder browse dialog returns cancel, then the last path isn't updated. The text box is not updated. This entire setup is skipped, so no change there. It's basically just taking care of keeping a sort of default setup and ignoring things that should be ignored. If when we are saving the profile, if the backup checkbox has been set, then we need to deal with whatever's in the backup path. But if it's set up as a restart, then we need to ignore whatever might be in the backup path text box because that path is irrelevant to a restart profile. So it's just a quick and easy way of making sure that we deal with what we have to deal with and ignore everything else that we don't have to deal with, regardless what's in there. Exactly, exactly. Um, let's say, for example, that you have specified one path and you then click the browse button again to specify a different path and then remember, oh, the first path that I selected was correct by canceling it there and ignoring what changes might be coming from the dialog. We effectively leave the initial path that was put in there by the first instance of the folder browse dialog. We leave that in there for the save button to catch when it's clicked. One thing that we can do to ensure that we have a valid backup profile is that we should actually go in here in the save button and check to see if the checkbox is set, and if it is set, check to see that the backup path text box actually contains a valid path, and if it does, then allow the saving of the scheduled profile data and close the editor. And if we don't have a valid path, then pop a message box to the user saying either you forgot to specify a path or you've not specified a valid path. Give it another shot and we'll take it from there. That's something that we really need to put in here. because we can't perform a backup to a non-existing path. Um, it just won't work. Or rather, that would result in the backup going to some temporary folder somewhere, and the user wouldn't be able to find it. So um, checks and balances. Make sure what you need to deal with is dealt with, and ignore everything else. Okay, so let's give that a quick check, shall we? Um, da, 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 da. Well, um, actually, I don't need to do that. Overall, we are building this as a standard desktop application that a user could potentially be able to start up. If the user can start this particular application, then there should be a fair chance that this particular user is also capable of creating a file in a specific folder somewhere. Whether that's the actual case is something that we will leave up to the backup manager to handle, because those permissions might be changed by the time the backup needs to trigger. Um, we're not building a Windows service, which means we don't have those particular issues per se. That's more when you're doing Windows services, because that then depends on which profile you're using. And it is a little bit beyond the scope of this particular application. So as such, we don't really need to deal with this right now. If we at some point decided to convert this into a Windows service, then yes, we definitely need to deal with it. But since it's just a standard desktop application that any user potentially is capable of starting up, it doesn't really matter. You usually have access to most of the folders that you can specify anyway, so we should be good. All right, so um, down here, just to remind ourselves, this profile to the current profile profile list. But up here we need to do the quick check to see if the specified path actually exists. So we'll do the check to see if the checkbox is set. If it is, then we kind of need to figure out whether the user actually specified a path or not. Depending whether a path was specified and whether it is a valid path, we can actually pop two different messages. So just for the sake of the argument, we'll do a trim if path length equals 0. The user forgot to click a backup path. Else if, and then we can do the standard IO. Oh, sorry, directory exists path, and then we of course need to put a not. The chosen folder doesn't exist. Boom. And in both cases, we can simply just return out of this method to avoid stuff being saved. That way we don't have to do any further checks. So here we'll throw a little message box. No, nah. What are we going to put in here? Please specify where you would like to store backups for this server instance, and that should be enough. No backup storage path specified. And we should be fine with an OK button, and we should also be fine with, I don't know, exclamation. That should be fine. Da, 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 da. Wow, seriously? Um, there's no reason for that kind of language in JetBlue. Um, well, for the most part, when I do dialogues like this, I kind of try to word the text in a way where I'm being courteous to the user instead of being arrogant. Um, no, not at all. I couldn't care less about your choice of language, but if you must pick that kind of language, then my advice to you is to go grow up. It's not needed. All right, so if the chosen path doesn't exist, for the most part it might. Exactly, pointing out how to correct the situation. There we go. We could even be um, kind enough to focus the button, so we might as well do that. Whoops. There we go. And if the path doesn't exist, then we can actually ask the user if the path should be created. However, since we're using the folder browse dialog to handle the path selection for us, this is an instance that might never happen. Um, it could happen if the selected path was put in the dialog and you then switch to, say, Windows Explorer and delete the path. Then it might not exist. We could just ignore the fact that it doesn't exist and then simply force create it whenever the backup is executed, which we might do anyway, just to make sure that we are actually able to put files in there. There are plenty of different scenarios we could go through. For the moment, I think we'll just ignore this particular setup. We could instead check that it is a potentially valid path. Um, yes, it does. It does. Um, whenever you can utilize the features available in some of the built-in stuff, you might as well do it because it saves you a lot of hassle doing things manually. Having said that, um, I like to make sure whenever I build something that deals with, say, the file system or some other kind of I/O. Um, so in essence, it doesn't really matter whether I need to properly check this particular path because when I need to do the file access anyway, say when we're building a backup, I would do these checks regardless for the simple reason whenever you're dealing with a file system, there could be hundreds of different reasons why, say, this particular folder is gone or why this particular file exists that we're attempting to write to. It could be locked and so on and so forth. So in all these situations, I always make sure that it's properly wrapped in a try-catch, and the proper checks have been made before I even attempt to write any kind of data to disk. So here it doesn't really matter. What matters is if the user selected, or sorry, forgot to select a specific path for this backup schedule, then we at least need to tell the user that, hey, you need to specify where you want these backups stored. Please do that and try again. We'll just leave it at that. And since we've popped a message box here, we'll return to exit out. There we go. All right, so next up, we kind of need to store the information. So we will grab the array that we are currently storing, resize, there we go, the scheduled profiles in, which would be that one. Add one more entry to it. There we go. And then add the current one to the end of the list, which would be the temp schedule. There we go. That effectively adds this to the end of the list. Then you would say, well, this doesn't exactly sort all of the different schedules according to time of day. No, it doesn't. For that, we're going to build a helper method that takes care of this sorting for us. And why do we want to do that? Well, check for a race condition. What's a race condition? Something like read-only attributes, stuff like that. Um, well, my guess would be that that's something more Linux related, to be honest. When dealing with NTFS file systems on Windows platforms, the typical way of going about it is if you need to write a file that might exist ahead, you could run into a file naming conflict, of course. Okay, that way, yeah. Well, NTFS employs a locking system for files, which means that whenever you try to write to a file, that file is effectively locked from being accessed by any other application or any other thread. Whenever the handle to the file is closed, that lock is then released. That is something that C# handles internally. It's not something that we manually have to do. So yeah, that's typically something that NTFS handles for us, for the most part. Thank you very much for the follow. Which unlistenable gaming. That's a pretty interesting name. um, um, for the most part, all of the intricate, really deep technical stuff that depends on things like file systems and operating systems and stuff, that's something that .NET handles for us. The whole ideology behind .NET is to grant us as developers a development platform where we have the freedom and the power to create the applications that we want to, but without us having to do all of the old school manual stuff like memory management and file handle clearing and so on and so forth. Thank you very much for the follow, Paula Bean. Um, um, C Sharp, any of the other .NET languages, and in case you don't know, you can actually cross-language develop within the same project and still compile an executable out of it. So one developer could do VB.NET development, another one C Sharp, a third one could do J Sharp and compile the project together as one single executable. That is actually possible with the .NET framework and the languages within. Um, it's not particularly easy getting it to actually do it, but it's possible. Anyway, back to the profile sorting. See, one of the reasons that I wanted to do a helper method for doing this sorting is that when we apply the list of schedule profiles through the schedule profiles property, I think it would be a nice thing if we could um, force this dialog to sort the schedule profiles by time of day. There we go. So a helper method would definitely do that trick for us. So we'll put that in here. Um, well, there was a question, yes, is there a reason you don't use the add method of the array object? Well, one of the reasons that I'm kind of hardwired to using this approach deals with weird finicky stuff happening in earlier versions of the .NET framework. Sometimes when you used structures and used the add method, it added a reference to the variable instead of adding the actual data, which meant if you immediately after adding a structure to the array changed the contents of the variable that contains the struct, then that would reflect within the array itself as well, because it stored a reference to the variable instead of actually dropping the data in there. I found that by forcing a structure into the array by means of the equal sign, it forces .NET to always copy over the data instead of just storing a reference. So that's the main reason why I do the, how should I put this, old way of resizing the array and stuffing the data in there. It's simply to ensure that it doesn't store a reference and instead stores the actual data. I know that this has been fixed a long time ago, but I got into the habit of doing it this way. Better safe than sorry. Yes, when you assign it with the equal sign like this, it makes an actual memory copy of the structure. Whereas the add method in previous versions of the .NET framework had the choice between storing a reference to the variable that was added to it instead of copying over the data, which then forced me to do this instead. So I just got into the habit of doing it this way because then at least I know for sure that it will always do an actual memory copy of the structure. So bad habit, I guess. Okay, so we still need to build a method that can do the schedule profile sorting. So let's go up to the helper methods and see if we can get that started. Collapse these because we don't need to look at them. So S would be down here. Put it in here, sort schedule profiles, and declare the method for it, and then we will get started. But before we do that, time for a nature break. I will be back shortly.